Hey all, this is a two-part episode, so if you are listening to this episode first, you are doing it wrong. Go back and listen to part one first, and then listen to this one. Thanks.
Yo, you ever just be like living your daily life, and you wanna fulfill a long held like child dream, like become a hero, and you go off, you train your hardest, you come back 3 years later, you've become an unstoppable. It's this hero shit. It's like it's too easy. It's not even like anything in your dreams. It just turns out that this adult life you've always been fantasizing for yourself is just some dull, mundane thing, and you're just going through the motions. Even worse now, there's the Heroes Association. What the fuck was that shit? You were here before the Heroes Association. They have the rules and regulations. They're giving these boring ass tests. You're not here for these tests. Go there, you score. You have some hot young shot like 19-year-old who has the sponsorship of his father, and boom, he's in like right in an investment firm, almost named partner at his father's legal firm, and you're just here getting out of college, and you have to pay back loans. And then
some bald guy that did push-ups and sit-ups comes and beats you in one punch.
Yeah. You've got this sweet ass bike. You've been fighting all your life. You put your entire body on the line, and then you watch this one dude defeat the giant frog monster that's destroyed the city in one punch. And what do you get? Not even the damages for your bicycle.
Class C.
You know, that's actually word for word what I tell people when they ask me in an interview, like what I want to do with my life and why I don't have a job yet. It's like, well, so I just say exactly what you just said. Careful.
So, yeah.
So that's what I hear.
So basically, yeah. Next, I point out that at the root of all revenue collection by businesses is the rationing of industry. So Bickler and Nitzan call it sabotage. I think sabotage fits a lot of what they do, but a lot of it is also just straight rationing. And the first example, of course, is insulin, where people literally cannot afford their insulin, so they have to ration it and often like die, which is just fucked. Because like they just raised the price on it. That's the only reason that this happened. It has nothing to do with the realities of industry. It's just some businesses decided we're not making enough money from this insulin, so now the price is higher, and now people are dying. Well, oh well, that's not our fault. They just can't afford it. They should have gotten a better job.
But see, this is where the laws of supply and demand come in. And
oh yeah, that's right.
You might not see it yet.
I forgot about that.
It kind of sucks because like you said, this is like an artificial rationing where I mean they just artificially raise the price because this isn't something where it does work like supply and demand, which is something just for like what I guess you call that like microeconomics, some old bullshit. But when companies grow to this extent and they have as much power as they wield and they have a sort of exclusivity, especially over these drugs, which they then patent out and they get the exclusive rights to produce, tomorrow they can just be like, yeah, this doesn't cost an affordable amount anymore. You're now forking over $2,000 a month to have this life-saving drug given to you. Whereas previously it might have been something affordable, like $80. Like I know like the markup for a lot of prescription medication has drastically increased, and like you said, like people have literally died from this. I think like one of the most heartbreaking one is like seeing like a GoFundMe $50 short of getting a insulin thing, and the end to that story is then the guy just dies. Like that, the end. That's
so fucked, man.
We should take that $50 and buy us some bullets.
Yeah. So I was watching that the series by the guy who does the alt-right playbook, and he had a video where he was like explaining conservatism and
God.
basically like the fundamental part of conservatism is like the belief that hierarchies are natural and just. And so like their argument when you talk about drug prices is always, well, they use the profits to research drugs, so without them you wouldn't have drugs because nobody would be paying for research or whatever.
Right.
Which is essentially just saying like whatever happens to the peasants is justified because the lords of the pharmaceutical industry, they are in their proper place and they know what's best for you, and you should just shut up and know your place because they're the ones that are saving people's lives in the first place.
Right. Well, and also the constant talk of laziness of the poor, that the poor deserve to be poor because they're lazy.
If you read econ from like the 17th century, they're saying the exact same shit. They're all talking about the indolent peasants.
It's all this bullshit. The thing, right, is that those thoughts were transmitted to conservatives from nobility and merchants because those people
via their reptile organs.
Right. Those people wanted people to work harder and somehow felt entitled or just wanted to spread lies and propaganda about how, they deserve to be in these positions of, owning property and owning the right to distribute and have distributional coalitions, and that the workers and peasants and so forth, when they didn't comply to like whatever fucking whim they came up with, it's because you're lazy and bad, you're literally of poor moral character, and you're a subhuman beast and all this shit, right? Because
indolent, vagrant, etc.
Exactly, because like I think it was American Johnson did like a non-compete episode about like capitalist performativity and how like you perform these roles that are like not you, but they are fitted to the necessary kind of flow of power into other people, essentially, right? Like they're there to get shit for other people, right? And so like non-cooperation is just one of the ways that people resist that stuff, So it's kind of hilarious when libs are like resist, and then they do exactly what they've always done, which is almost, it's just performance, right? Exactly, right. So you're like, okay, have you tried burning a trash can? I don't know.
I mean, so, it could work, but guys, isn't that like illegal though?
Right, exactly, right. And that's the thing is, it's like this is speaking of the lib thing about like politics and economics are distinct and all this bullshit, but also like, oh well, if there's legal and electoral mechanisms, then we can just use those. It's like a vast machine that they just assume it's either broken when they don't like it, and when they do like it or they don't really mind it, then it's fixed and it's working. And they're just like, we'll just press the buttons and make it work, and it's just this weird myth. But that's just.
I mean that's one of the worst things. I know where I've worked. A lot of things is told us like, if you don't like it, guys, then just stick it through, get promoted, and then change things when you're on the other side.
Right,
it's like,
right.
Well, how about we
now?
Just change it now?
Yeah. It's all social. It's yeah.
I mean, it's dumb because I'm especially pissed off because I got called in early into work today because they decided to do one of these like bullshit like, oh, let's do a leadership seminar, and it's like 2 hours early into work for this bullshit. And it's basically talking about like, so when you guys are supervisors and everything, you have to think about how you're going to handle your guys, and it's important to remember to treat them like people. And it's like, you get 2 hours of this, like, why can't you just start treating us like people like goddamn now?
Yeah, right.
I'm going to handle my guys like Nestor Makhno. What do you think of that?
Yeah. Let's get it done.
Yeah, I was also thinking like, like modern liberals are very conservative as well because like they sort of have the same belief system where the system is just and the hierarchies are just, as long as they are the ones that are in the right place, like they're the ones that are supposed to be in charge. And if they're not in charge, anything that happens that's bad is just because they're not the ones that are in charge of it. It's not because the system is wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and this is, yeah, exactly. Like they believe in a kind of, technocratic hierarchy, where they're like, oh, no, you see that other stuff, that's, that conservative stuff, that reactionary stuff, that's just, that's Hobbesian brutality, and we don't like that. And so it's like they're going with a kind of an aesthetic, like an emotional impulse that is correct, but there's no power analysis. It's kind of like with ANCAPs. There's no power analysis. There's no actually looking under the fucking cover or the hood or whatever you want to call it. There's no actual getting into the fucking dirt with what's, let's talk about why the poor people are poor, right? And this is, I think, why there's.
I guess you could even extend this to like even nominal like communists, where they fundamentally believe that the state is just, but all the problems of society stem from communists not being in charge of it.
Well, I think that the idea, I get where you're coming from, and maybe just the way you're phrasing it rubs me a little wrong, but like it's more that the concept,
I mean, it's like a small subset of communists.
Oh, okay.
And a lot of them came into power through communist revolutions.
Right. I think that if I'm also not misinterpreting it, it's that like they see the state as like kind of like a modern innovation of society about society, and so it's like it's more value neutral. And so if they can just make the quote unquote dictatorship of the proletariat, so it's a bit, and I don't want to say this too strongly because I don't want to piss off any like commies who might be listening who I do like, but like
any dirty tankies.
Yeah, right. Well, not even them.
Foolishly listen to our podcast even though we're anarchists and we hate them.
Right. We can't break our own distributional coalition of podcasting. But the idea that the dictatorship of the proletariat must kind of arise out of the dialectic between the proles and everything else. I mean,
there's the interpretation that that's just like a turn of phrase, and that it means that the lower class should be in charge of themselves. And then there's the people that think it should be like a literal dictatorship, which I think is probably a tiny fringe minority.
Creation of apparatchiks,
but they do exist.
Yeah. Well, what I was going to say is I'm going to draw a comparison between that particular interpretation of that phrase and that concept of revolution and the liberal idea of kind of like a liberal technocracy, where they're like, oh, if we just put our enlightened selves into the upper echelons, then we will use that enlightenment and that technical savvy and the wonky shit that we have to make things better, right? But I will just granted, liberals want to maintain the existing state, generally speaking, and they just want to sit in the seats that already exist, and communists generally want to recompose the state in some other form, right? So anyway. Yeah.
So the next thing here is I talk about modern monetary theory and how it kind of revives chartalism, which is the theory, and when I say theory, I mean explanation of reality, of course, that money is a fiction of the state, and that it is essentially used to, as I say often on the show, to mobilize a subjugated workforce using the currency that they issue. Through the mechanisms of taxation, property ownership, rent, and all that sort of stuff. And so in the last probably 50, 70 years or so, there's been this ideology developed, which I think we decided was called metalism, which is essentially the idea that money comes from people being taxed and that any government spending has to be done through taxation. And so you have to explain how to pay for everything if you're going to propose that the government do stuff. And So that's the common refrain of liberals and conservatives both to any suggestion of a not even socialist but socially beneficial program like Medicare is how do you pay for it? Which the reality is that it doesn't matter how you pay for it. All you're doing is mobilizing the labor that is already subjugated to the state, and doing so through spending money, and all you have to do is just create that money if you don't have it, because you are the state.
Right.
Maybe.
Right. Exactly.
Maybe that's the thing is, even though I don't know how you're using subjugated to the state in that sentence, but it's like I think the thing is that doctors and insurance companies currently are like they certainly pay taxes, so they're subjugated in that sense. But like the doctors and insurance workers themselves are more so subjugated to these private forces, and it's likely
when
like
I say state, when I say state, I'm also including businesses. So like the fact that we have to pay for stuff in order to live our daily lives, you're paying organs of the state, which are businesses. And so to be a subjugated worker just means you have to earn money.
Oh yeah, you got me there, fam. That's actually that's okay. Now I'm with you. And
corporations in particular, like just quote unquote businesses, but corporations in particular. We kind of covered this in at least one episode before, but since they have this kind of hierarchical structure, they're kind of like free floating cancerous bodies within the body of the state that they're like
unofficial government agencies, basically.
Unofficial agencies, exactly.
Semi-official.
Sorry, you said organs already, so now I'm fucking up the metaphor. But like,
oh, okay. I didn't know I said that.
But they're cancers for us. is the problem?
Yeah.
And they're essentially, because they have institutional legal backing and so forth. They're really just they kind of have to be buddy with the state in some sense, and the state has to be buddy with them. And so the distinction between the two is actually not very significant.
Definitely, and certainly not from a lot of people's perspective, regardless of whether it's like the literal government or if it's like Blue Cross Blue Shield. Like, who the fuck cares? You're forking over money, and that's like you're under somebody's thumb.
Exactly.
And that's
and so the government could easily just hand of God create and destroy any of these businesses if they wanted to. The problem is that they are controlled by parts of the same upper class that control those businesses.
Yeah, the sad thing is like the hand doesn't want to destroy itself in that sense.
Right.
Yeah.
And
I mean, it essentially allows, like, we have this fiction that we're in a democracy, which if you've studied enough, you know that we're not. But even if you take that at its face, we have, like, the vast majority of our society is organized under business, and business is just an autocracy. So it's like kind of a Trojan horse for, getting everyone to be subject to these mini dictatorships, or
exactly
in the case of large corporations, like regular sized dictatorships.
exactly. And that's why if you want to go to the favorite extreme example of every leftist, that's why fascism does what it does, right? Nationalizing corporations within this, like within and in conjunction with the state, so that all of the autocracies are brought under the same head autocracy, using all this sort of jargon and ideology and aesthetics and propaganda of things like family and tradition in order to seal social bonds to the the hierarchical, oppressive, autocratic apparatus which embodies the state and corporations. So.
And then I think probably the saddest part out of all of this is even back to the argument, well, how are you going to pay for this? And certainly the example that everyone always brings up by necessity, because it's the largest part of our spending, is like when you look at military spending, no one ever asks, like, how are you going to pay for all of these bombs that we're going to just drop on children in any number of countries, like Yemen? Like, no one ever asks how you're going to pay for that. We just fucking forked over the bombs and everything. I mean, that's a large part of the remaining industry within the United States that we haven't deindustrialized, is just weapons manufacturing for our military and militaries abroad that just do what we want them to do.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, and Bickler and Nitzan call war the ultimate act of sabotage and point out how often it's used to profit businesses, which I think we all became keenly aware of during the Iraq War, which they predicted, by the way. That's another thing I mentioned in this article, is they literally predicted the Iraq War using their theory of capitalism, which I think is like, what better endorsement of it is there than that?
That's actually like pretty crazy that that you could like isolate a variable like that, like what the oil barrel price.
Yeah, it's the differential capitalization of oil companies. So basically, like, they have this group of oil companies that they call the Petrocorp, and so they look at their, like, the total outstanding value of all their stocks relative to the rest of that industry, and when that difference, like when the difference between the top oil companies and the rest start to drop, then it's followed by some sort of war in an energy-rich area.
That's absolutely dystopic. That's a real analysis that gets scary.
Yeah.
I mean, it makes a lot of sense in hindsight, and especially when you consider how the war drums beat for Venezuela, and now they're beating for Iran, two of the places that have very large oil reserves and have a large portion of their economy dependent upon the oil. That's...
Yeah. I mean, there's also like a component to it of like neocon ideology, where like one of the things that really made me like just virulently opposed to conservatism was this video that I saw probably in like 2010, 2011, where some like Secretary of Defense was, and I think this was like a leaked thing, was saying like, our plans are to basically, he didn't say this, but like to start wars in Iran, Iraq, Syria, Egypt, like basically every war that we've gone through in the past 2 decades was like named as a target in like the 1980s. Like they were planning to do all this shit. And I don't know if it was because of the oil thing, or if it was just because like that, like they are ideologically like, white supremacists, like anti-Muslim, etc.
I mean, it all just lines up so well, ends up reinforcing each other. I mean,
yep.
And I mean, at this point, it begs the question whether you even need the chicken or the egg question. I mean, they're both fucking there at this point.
Yeah. There's, eggs and chickens and chicken cum all over the place, and it's just a big mess.
Yeah. Just awful.
It's chicken and egg bukkake.
Ugh. Oh God.
There's our anime tie-in.
Oh God.
That's one way to make your omru rice.
Okay, so next I talk about how we already kind of mentioned it, like the state controls the rationing system that we have. Taxes, prices, and wages are the rationing system. Taxes are controlled by the government, which is one half of the state. Prices are controlled, like mostly directly, but sometimes through a power struggle by the other half of the state, which is corporations. And then, wages obviously are like a very conflictual process between workers and corporations in the state, or in the government, rather. So basically, like, the government can prevent any form of suffering that they choose. They just choose not to because they are the tool of the upper class.
Yeah, I was about to say sometimes they do prevent suffering, but usually just for like the rich. I mean, I remember a tax cut going through.
Well, sure, yeah, yeah.
A lot of rich people suffering, I think, was prevented, with the presidency. They certainly got their tax cuts through, and the most interesting point is like the price setting, because that is definitely because we mentioned earlier, like. How they've done that certainly in the pharmaceutical industry, but I mean that happens all across the board, because the firms are so large at this point that they just literally decide what the price point is and how they're going to run that, and there's no input that you can put back into that in any way that makes any sense, especially
when just having control of the entire supply of something is important to people's lives as insulin means you have total pricing power. You can charge people whatever you fucking want.
Yeah, and the worst part is, like, even these power struggles, which I think a lot of liberal economists would say would alleviate the ideas of monopoly, is like, yeah, if you get too complacent, if you keep your prices too high, your competitors will come in and undersell you. It's like, yeah, but that shit doesn't happen.
Yeah, that thing that totally happens. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, thing that only happens.
I remember what I was going to say. It's also like, inflation, which is prices going up over time, is blamed by people who are in favor of this system blame inflation on the government by saying that inflation is a product of the government issuing too much money. Usually. This is brought up in the context of any sort of socially beneficial programs that the government creates. So if they were to do a Green New Deal or Medicare for All, and they paid for it by printing money, then that would disrupt the hierarchy, the proper hierarchy, the proper order of things, and cause inflation, which is when too much money chases too few goods, and that devalues money. And so you're actually being counterproductive. Whereas in reality, inflation is when prices go up. You can think of it as money being devalued, but that doesn't mean that's what it actually is. That's just a metaphor. And the actual cause of it is businesses increasing their power over society, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Dang.
Yeah. Yeah, I was going to say, one of the reasons, I think that honestly the ultimate logic of like the kind of mechanistic logic of keeping wages stagnated, continuing to raise prices and so forth, and creating, increasing that difference between the classes through income and income security and stuff, really just to pressure labor into becoming more compliant, right? Like, it's not necessarily about, a lot of times, yes, it is about cruelty, but most of it seems to me to be this kind of cold, lizardy logic of like, we just want them to compete more, to work more. And how are we going to do that? We will, we'll do bullshit jobs. We'll do, lower wage prices and higher commodity prices and property prices and so forth, and use that.
Yeah, I was going to mention this earlier, but a lot of the ideology behind this, like, they have their side of it, which is like, we deserve to be here because we're better than everyone.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But then the flip side of that is the poor should be suffering because that's actually better for them.
Right,
in the 17th century or the 18th century, I can't remember which fucking one it was, but anyway, it was like scarcity is good for the peasants because when times are scarce, they become more industrious, and that makes them happier. And they're using France as an example of this, and Scotland as the counterexample, where they had plenty and they were like lazy and didn't do anything, and so that meant they were sad. And that carries through today, where you're supposed to be happier if you work hard and earn your keep.
Yeah. Well, and it kind of has to do. I am sure that a lot of our more kind of philosophically grounded and educated friends would be able to actually make this point more clearly and with more precision. But philosophy and ideology and social theories as kind of a subset of philosophy or topic of philosophy for a long, long time, and even until the present day in various groups and circles, it was this kind of like, I will come up with a thought experiment about the world, or I'll come up with in my own head some kind of model, and then I'll go out and I'll kind of find confirmation for it in the world via confirmation bias, basically, and say, you see, virtue is good, and virtue is what I say it is based on my kind of weird aristocratic, sort of quasi-biblical or quasi-religious anyway.
Aristotle-cratic.
Yeah, right, yeah, exactly. And then I'll go out and I'll find a bunch of peasants, having a fucking break because they fucking earned it. And I'll say, these people are being lazy, and I don't like it because I already have like a classist mentality. So then I'll come up with a reason why I don't like that, but I'll say it's logical. And then, I'll just a priori bullshit. So, for hundreds of years, aristocrats and merchants have been dining on their own shit and then calling it philosophy and passing it on to us as like canon. And this is one reason I think why the various leftist thinkers were so explosive and why they're so dangerous even now. Even if we now say, well, they're a little outdated and stuff, they're still extremely relevant in that they overturn a lot of this kind of weird a priori and like virtue-based thinking in like at least the Western canon. Where it's just a bunch of fucking dickheads projecting onto people who don't have any money,
And even within, I know the Black community in America, where there isn't necessarily that long intellectual tradition simply by virtue of their culture being robbed from them. You have figures such as Booker Washington. And he is one of the early capitalists, and he preaches for the African American community to advance themselves through capitalism. You have the right to work now. You're no longer slaves. If you work, you can find success in the system. And there are people who then follow Booker T. Washington, both while he's actively saying this. You have like early socialist figures such as George Woodby, who's black socialist preacher, who was active around the time of the IWW, actually entered into the National Socialist Party that ran Eugene Debs, who opposed him within the African American community, talking how like the only way out of the situation that black people find themselves in would be through some sort of syndicalism. You have W.E.B. Du Bois, who critiques him at the time and also after the fact, saying that, as African Americans entered the capitalist system, you only recreated the same system of haves and have-nots of the white community. Yeah. Before Booker T. Washington, you have somebody like Peter H. Clark, who spoke during the time.
Did Boule exist at this point, or was that before that?
Boule?
Yeah.
I can't place them off the top of my head because I mean I've done a little bit of reading, just enough to know what I know, and maybe even not enough yet to know what I don't know yet about the African American intellectual tradition, especially for leftists, because it's so hidden. Because it gets neglected. They don't typically hook that well into the white leftist tradition, and even the white leftist tradition in the United States is a bit better, even though that's neglected overall within the history system. I mean, that goes doubly so for the Black community, and the records for them and their writings and their speakings is even worse off. You have to dig even deeper to get at them. Reasons why I think groups like the Black Socialists of America do a service, if only like for the historical value, to start helping people connect back into traditions which are lost.
Yeah, that stuff
for the
kicks
most
ass.
part.
Yeah. So I just found it. It was founded in 1904. So probably that was happening before that was founded.
Yeah. Because I mean, I know that Booker T. Washington was active in the early 20th century. So, I mean, basically.
Members of include W.E.B. Du Bois.
Yeah,
that's the first one they name here. So.
And like, I mean, the big thing he's known for is the founding of the NAACP, which unfortunately is a long way from from perhaps its radical nature back in the early 20th century. It's sort of become this liberal institution, which sort of just lends itself to legitimization of the state solely by its existence, recognizing more so like high-ranking military officials and politicians within the Black community and other people of cultural significance, rather than continuing to advocate for radical change. The reason why you need other organizations to enter in, like Black Lives Matter, who once again are brought to the forefront conditions faced almost significantly by African Americans, and probably you need it to happen again, because even with that organization, you're starting to see it sort of being subsumed into the machine.
Right.
But neither here nor there. We're far away off of just talking about.
Well, I don't think we're that far off, because I was thinking that it seems like I mean, we're basically talking about redistributional coalitions, and it seems that if you get into one of these high-level positions in the organization's hierarchy and you have enough wealth, then you kind of, settle on everything being fine now. And it kind of like, I don't know, maybe if you're like someone who's kind of a radical, at least to some degree, and then you get into like one of these positions in these redistributional coalitions, then your radicalism sort of disappears because you're fine, and your empathy doesn't go far enough to continue your work or whatever, I guess.
Oh, certainly, and I think you find that because at one point, W.E.B. Du Bois, not necessarily known for being the most outspoken like anti-capitalist or communist, certainly with none of those who would follow him, but he at one point wrote about how under FDR, capitalism had a progressive character, which almost seemed like maybe you could preserve the system if it only continued to make the same sort of changes that you saw under FDR, which a little bit lacks the power analysis that FDR necessarily isn't the one responsible for those changes, because he's responding to a militant labor uprising, which upends just the state control through taxes and the business control through prices, because now the overall distributional coalition, labor unions, enter on the scene in a major way, which threatens to upend both hierarchies. So, I mean, that progressive coalition can only be found. You can only find like the government willing to reduce the suffering in taxes and start pulling the leash on corporations only when when the gun is to its head, basically.
Yeah. So I clicked on W.B. Du Bois here on Wikipedia, and it says he's a Pan-Africanist, and that got me thinking that like that's sort of a movement for a very large distributional coalition where you're not necessarily opposed to there being a social hierarchy, but if you can, you would like all of your people to be, in this big group that benefits from that hierarchy. Because I don't know, it seems like there's a lot of people that are not socialists that are Pan-Africanists, and I've always wondered like why those ideas are compatible, like being a capitalist and a Pan-Africanist.
Well, I mean, I think there are a lot of things theorized, and I really am underread in this way to speak up. So like why like Pan Africanism would be compatible with capitalism? I mean, but overall, the first and foremost concern I think with African Americans was the yoke of slavery, and after that's overthrown.
Right.
Like that looks like the big hurdle you got to climb in order to have your life righted. Even though I think George Woodbey, which is one of my first entries into not necessarily Pan-Africanism, but just someone within the African American community making an anti-capitalist analysis, also views capitalism as just like the actual big bad behind slavery. Like slavery wasn't just like the final villain for African Americans, but it was that. But the horrors of chattel slavery are almost unique in their brutality. So yeah, and even following slavery, you still have like these extra legal these not sort of against the law,
like
but
the newer forms of slavery.
Yeah, I mean, like outright racism, the Jim Crow laws. So you have like the state putting down its thing. You have groups such as like the Ku Klux Klan actively working to destroy the African American community with every chance they got, either through the state or outside of the actual state itself, just through like citizens councils and everything. So I mean, Pan-Africanism might be a response to racism first and foremost, and you don't even have the time to address overall what might be driving it together. It's not often that you do find them eventually tying into a larger socialist movement, and even though the communist movement did fight against the evils of racism, Jim Crow laws and everything, fought against segregation. It isn't that often, and sometimes within the early like socialist movements of the early 20th century, eventually the same racist mentality does end up infecting these things, and they don't want to work with the black population. The black population is sometimes a little bit wary of working with white people, and for good reason. Fair enough. And it's that sort of like tenuous relationship that they have to each other, which I think prevents it from really becoming an ingrained part of within the black community, like socialism from really taking root all throughout the community. I mean, it's hard enough for anybody to collectivize, but now you're talking about people who are just trying to get the boot off their neck. So
yeah, I think part of that is like getting people to trust in the ideology and not getting like trying to get black people necessarily on board with white movements.
Yeah, and that's really what's at the forefront is that I mean, I mentioned that George Woodbey entered the Nationalist Socialist Party. At one point, he was nominated to be the vice president for Eugene Debs, but the other side to that story and the ending to it is he receives only one vote. Because, I mean, he's the only black person at that point in the National Socialist Party, but he still took it upon himself to enter it because, you know, at the very least, like he recognizes like socialism would be a great thing and it probably would be great for black people. Yeah. But like socialists are just hard to reach out to the black community. And you also have to keep in mind at this point within the black community, there's also like this idea of like the black church. And at the same time, there's also the Marxist critique of religion. So they look at like the religious black community, and they're like, those guys are religious.
Right.
Christianity is actually not the move. I mean, which also ignores like the fact that not only George Woodby is a socialist Christian, but I mean, even within the white community, there are socialist Christian movements that don't necessarily philosophically ground themselves, but they religiously ground themselves, like a sort of idealism over materialism, but it leads you to the same conclusions, whether you're doing scientific socialism or you're doing like a socialism of the heart, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, so there are a lot of things that have kept us apart, and that's not to say that you can't form coalitions, but there's this idea of autonomy that you would hope that socialism is trying to lead you to where you're no longer just this, subjugated person, as we were talking about earlier, who's subjugated by the state, be it by the literal government or corporations. And you want to take that off of you, but within doing that, you don't want to recreate hierarchies where the marginalized are still pushed to the margins.
Right. Also, point of I think correction. You were referring to the National Socialist Party, and I think you meant the Socialist Party of America.
Whoops. But yeah, that's what I meant. I'm sorry.
I didn't know what the actual name was, and I was going to clarify originally. Like, by the way, this isn't the Nazi Party.
This isn't. I'm so sorry, guys.
I didn't know the name either.
Party, which is Nazi, but yeah, we're talking about the Socialist Party of America, which
yeah.
I just figured out from context you're talking about America, not Germany. I was like, okay, so not those National Socialists. Maybe they were called the National Socialist Party. I don't know.
Yeah, that's my guys. Like I said, I don't read enough. I read enough to know what I know, and not even to not know what I don't know yet. So
yeah. Okay, so I think we kind of talked about prices not being like. Yeah,
they're not rational so much as.
Yeah, I think one thing I didn't mention in here. Oh no, I did. Okay, yeah. So studies by Means and Burrell, they looked to study like corporate practices. I can't remember what their book is called, but one of their findings was that prices aren't like the result of the balancing of the forces of supply and demand, but are basically just like, how much does this? What's the unit cost of this product? Okay, $10. All right. So we want a 20% profit margin. So we're going to set the price to $12 for that. Yep. And that's how prices are formed. So,
I mean, I could say
it's not some like rational system. It's just businesses controlling distribution, controlling industry, etc. Which I think we've covered pretty well. And then I think this is a really I didn't get into this quite enough through the rest of it, but like, yeah, the upper class is pretty insulated from any actual failures. Actually, when I was traveling up to Massachusetts, me and my dad were driving together, and he started talking about how Trump is like a bad businessman, and I was like, I mean, not really, because he's still a businessman. Like, if you're a bad businessman, like, that means you will stop and become like a worker. Whereas if you're a good businessman, you can just keep getting fucking money to do whatever the fuck, get yourself paid and basically like do whatever you want.
Yeah.
And that's what he does. And that's like what the upper class is like a bunch of people like bailing themselves out of any trouble that they have, subjugating the lower class.
Yep. Yeah, my dad has a few friends who are like small business tyrants, of course. And so when I first started like popping off about socialism at my dad, he was like, well, what about so-and-so? And what about so-and-so? And I was like, personally, when we hang out with them,
they can work like the rest of us.
Yeah, right. And like, they're nice, but yeah, I was like, what the hell? Like if they're such nice guys, then like, why are they rich and their workers not rich? And my dad's like, And like in the one case, he was like, well, what about, my friend, I'll just call the guy Jim. What about my friend Jim, who has been trying to run this business for like, a couple decades and just can't make any money. And I was like, well, does the business still exist? And he's like, yeah. I was like, dude, like, Dad, that was my first job. I worked at that guy's place because he knows you and I'm your son. Like, that was lucky for me. And the job sucked and I made minimum wage, which is terrible. I was like, but like, he owns a house. It's not a great house. It's not a nice house, but he owns it. And his family has lived there all my life. Right. And
Yeah.
I was like, so what do you mean he's not making money? And he's like, well, he just has to keep taking loans out and stuff. I was like, okay, well, if that's the case, if he can't get out of debt, then maybe he would prefer to just be a worker. And my dad had no fucking comeback for that one. He's like, well, it's like, if he's really running out of money, then he's got a problem, right? But if he's not and he's able to stay afloat, then he doesn't have a problem, which means your entire argument just collapses, And it has to do, like you said, with your status as like a business owner, a CEO, whatever. Like credit scores and income and like people's judgment of you and reputation and how you deal with finance and the banks and stuff. It all changes when you are, a business tyrant or something.
Yeah, and then I think the other side, I don't want to steal your march on this,
Sure.
because it's in the same bullet point, but also as you're insulated from failure, you're also insulated from any of the consequences of your actions at that point, and not just actions, but like your like literal crimes. And you mentioned like the actual insulation from sexual assault. Be they women or children or both. And I think we were talking at the beginning, but like this is almost all too prescient at a time when Jeffrey Epstein is back in the news again. And the first time he got like a sweetheart deal, 13 months of you're in jail except when you want to go to work. And
today the judge went around like normal, some normal proceedings that would put a lot of people in jail ordinarily. Mm-hmm. I can't remember exactly what it was. I've had one too many sakes at this point, but today there was some sentencing thing that he basically got around, so that he can just keep doing what he wants while he's accused of raping dozens or hundreds of women and girls or whatever.
I mean, and not just the assault, but the trafficking and everything. He set up the logistics for all of this.
And the Lolita Express.
Oh, Jesus Christ!
I mean, it's guys like him, Weinstein. I mean, people who sit at the top of these hierarchies who make the most money, and they insulate themselves either with political connections, with the sheer amount of money they have. Mm-hmm. And I mean, you see these things time and time again, whether it's like OJ getting off because he just could afford the lawyer team to argue it out, or if you're looking at HR departments which handle within that economic hierarchy, and you see management preying upon their workers. I mean, and not even just for exploitation, but just sexual assaults again. It's the HR department at that point doesn't exist for you. It exists to insulate your senior management. And that's the real crime, because you want to believe that the system in some way exists for some sense of dignity to exist for you. But no, it just really just exists to protect them and insulate them. And you can see that in the way that that one teenage girl licked a thing of Bluebell ice cream, and is going away for 20 years, and that's bam, we closed the book, threw it at her, bam, no one messes with Texas and Bluebell ice cream. People, and Jeffrey Epstein has the rape island, and it's we can't figure out what to do with this guy. I mean, he's contributed so much to society somehow.
Right.
I mean, it's absolutely crazy because on the one hand, I mean, you can see it directly because one person licks the ice cream, you're a little bit scared to eat ice cream at this point. It just makes you a bit more conscious. So capital has to put its foot down on that. But I mean, who's going to spend any less money? Or even how do you even economically boycott Jeffrey Epstein? How do you do anything against him, which isn't just literal physical violence? It's also immaterial.
And the other thing that the Epstein case reveals is like how incestuous the upper class is. I know that's an anti-Semitic trope to say upper class or whatever, but Bill Clinton flew on his plane, and Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton are friends with Trump, and Epstein donated to like Chuck Schumer and Clinton and Bush and all these people. Like they have tighter relationships. Like billionaires have tighter relationships than like most coworkers have.
Oh yeah,
you know.
Well, let's take a little comparison, or a little observation here. When we talk about aristocracies in the past, or even now in where it's formal aristocracy, these are all people who are related to each other, who control military power, who control land power and labor power somehow or other. And they all breed with each other, even when it creates, things like the, Habsburg dude, I forget which one, but they fucking do it because that's part of the coalition maintenance and building. And so when you use the term incestuous, it's only partly a metaphor, right? And in fact, it brings us, the concept of like the kind of the quote unquote metaphorical incest within this coalition, and how that basically is used to kind of bring up how these networks work. In traditional aristocracy, that is how it works. In fascism, the metaphor of family is how they bring people in. In the, when we talked about surname studies, the Japanese kazoku, right? That term means both family and noble peerage. It's, with the mafia, you call it the family, right? All this bullshit is all about building a family, if you will, right? A network that operates like family, but which still fucks around and does horrible things into kind of interstices, partly because it's just able to, right? You just kind of, when you have power, the problem is, like the fundamental problem of power is that nobody tells you no anymore. The only people that can tell you no are people with equal or more power, right? We see throughout history the consequences of telling no to someone with power is that you get wiped out, or other people get wiped out as you duke it out.
And then they fail anyway.
Right? Exactly. And then also the warp that happens to a person's character, or their ability to be what we would all consider, like a rational and potentially good, like moral human being, that is basically taken away, or it's at least atrophied by an experience of power. And so the greater power you have, for example, if you're a billionaire, it's the same fucking thing as being a king or a baron or a person with a space laser cannon and a button. It's the same fucking thing. It might be arranged in different ways.
That reminds me, random tangent, but in the new Blade Runner, the scariest thing to me was that fucking satellite cannon. Did you guys see that movie?
Oh yeah. Oh totally, yeah. And they had to do
the part where the
the
woman from the big company just had this thing that she could deploy and just like wipe people out from her office. That was the scariest fucking shit I've ever seen.
Yeah, that was definitely. I was like, wow, what a world we're about to experience. Haha. Yeah. No, actually, I forget. I think I tweeted about this a few months ago. I was talking to a coworker at my last contract, and I was like, so because we're he's cool and like our age and chill, and we had like a few minutes to just do like fucking just personal chatting about like what we're actually interested in, not just like our fucking jobs. And I was like, so dude, I could tell he's like, kind of on our wavelength. I was like, so what do you think? Like, which do you think is the most accurate prediction? Mad Max, Blade Runner, or Children of Men? And he was like, probably
Okay.
Blade Runner. And I was like, okay. And then when we were talking, I was like, actually, I think it's that we're already in Children of Men, especially if you watch the movie version. Yeah, we're already there. It's a bunch of people in cages. It's a bunch of fucking random fucking violence in the streets, but like very state managed. And like everyone's trying to pretend things are normal, but we all know that it's not. It isn't normal.
And many of the problems from within capitalist societies are caused by low fertility rates.
Right, right.
And would be solved by open borders, but
right,
we don't want to do that. So.
Right, exactly. And of course, low fertility is basically just like a metaphor for like fascist anxiety. Yeah, and then through that process, we're going to become Blade Runner through just like this increase in like high technomass on the one side and like extreme shit like laser cannons, and then like the kind of evisceration of workers and the kind of like spewing of waste and junk on the other side, which is then to be mediated by the Blade Runners, or not the Blade Runners themselves, but like the fucking synths or whatever they call them.
Replicants.
Replicants, that's right. Sorry, fucking sci-fi. I love it, but can't keep it straight. And then, of course, eventually it turns into Mad Max because it's unsustainable, right? And everybody just fucking blows each other away with their fucking laser cannons. Or at least,
I'm hoping it's more like Nausicaa, where there's some pockets of nice green valleys where everyone's, living nice and
totally,
doing
yeah,
ecological shit.
Yeah, I think that if we do go the route that I'm describing, like eventually there will be that, but we'll have to also endure there will be the fucking Tomekians and stuff running around just being like dipshits for 1,000 years, flying like broken asshole bomber planes, because that's all that's left, and the bugs are angry. Yeah.
I wish the bugs were angry.
I wish the bugs would fucking do that. Yeah. Filter our water, it'd be nice.
So we're getting pretty up there.
Those are Pan-Africanists. Sorry, go ahead.
So, I guess I'll just read the conclusion, and then we can do any final thoughts that we have, and then plugs, and then we'll call it a night. So, the society that we live in could hardly be further from a meritocracy. The best ways to get ahead in life are to be born into the upper class, impose rationing on the lower class, and ensure your upper class friends and family face no consequences for their failures or atrocities. If tens of thousands die every year because of healthcare rationing, or millions die in a war to boost oil profits, it's just a cost of doing business. For the rest of us, our options are to continue suffering under a class system, or to take power away from the state that is enforcing it. So, John, any final thoughts?
Ooh, I feel like that's spot on, and I wish that taking power away from the state was as easy as writing that sentence.
I know. Yeah, definitely agreed. That's the hard part, really. But also getting people to get on board, I think, is a pretty hard part as well.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And definitely, like, the one thing is like meritocracy is sort of like not even that far away from. I know we were talking earlier about the differences between conservatism and liberalism has this softer idea of a technocracy, but I mean, in the end, it sort of just blends with, other projects like saying that we already live in a meritocracy instead of like going through the hard work of like establishing it, even if such a thing were possible to actually put the most qualified people in most qualified positions, as if that would make the hierarchy any more justified if you did so. And instead of just saying that the most qualified people are already in the most qualified positions, it ends up becoming like this sort of like cosmopolitan white supremacy sort of.
Yeah.
Basically, everyone has a shot at being the chosen ones in a meritocracy, and it's just as much as bullshit as the ethnic versions of that. And I mean, I'm not sure what the way is for people to realize that they're all in that situation where they're at the bottom. They could be one of the millions dying in war, one of the millions dying from lack of insulin. I mean, they're already doing that. I don't know what it would take for them to realize that they're doing that collectively as a group and to take power away from the state. But I hope I get to see the beginnings of it at least going on. Either that or I hope I get my Yang Bucks. Either way.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I think one of the things about the meritocratic myth that needs to be also addressed. This is actually one of the ways that I got into fucking communism, is that like I started to think about kind of libertarian, as in truly libertarian societies. As like I was like, okay, we want maximum freedom, but we also want maximum security, as in like human, social, personal security and assurances. And because we are not in a true scarcity environment, like and economy and all this, right? And I realized I was like, even if we were talking about maximizing potential, which is this kind of liberal shit, even if we were, assigning people according to their best possible function in this kind of more meritocratic, technocratic kind of way, the only way that you can use a free the only way that you can maintain freedom while doing all of that is if there were assurances in place for you to be able to not just fill a position, but to not fill a position, right? You have to be able to choose unemployment, if you will, of sorts, or to be employed in really any variety of ways in order to not so much rise to the top, but rise into the most proper position or the most appropriate kind of contribution or work or job or whatever you want to call it, right? Whatever it may be about that. And so it seems that you need a libertarian socialist arrangement of some kind. At the very, very fucking least, you need a welfare state. And, that's like, the furthest right I'm going to go, right? That's the very least you can do in order to get the right people doing the right work at the right times, but doing so for more or less freely, rather than being either coerced through, wage pressure, or even worse, through actual police and or corporate coercion, or some combination thereof, which of course we know has been very common in the past and is still true for a lot of people today. So so that's kind of how I got into a lot of that sort of thinking, especially in grad school. And I was like, man, even market socialism, however that might work, sounds okay. Because people would be able to do the things they're good at. But then at the same time, I was like, well, if you carry the logic further, right, then income disparities are inherently anti-progressive and sort of anti-human, because they block those possibilities from happening, right? And they create perverse incentives for people to do one or the other job. So that's another way that I became even more radically egalitarian, was realizing that through mainstream economic thought, I kind of fell through the crack there, and I was like, the idea of perverse incentives is very valid and powerful. It applies to a lot of things, but it describes the current state of the economy, not just weird scenarios where like, the Vietnamese would grow rats to cut off their tails and get reward money from the French, which is the thing they did, but actually the disparity in income between a property owner, like say a rentier or a publishing house owner or senior editor or something like that, or a fucking technologist of some kind, like a startup motherfucker, and somebody like me who has to work 2 jobs commonly now, etc. Like I could be doing other things with my brain and my body that I would be much better at than like bar backing, right? But the wage pressure and the quote unquote availability of bullshit jobs, basically, and the false scarcity there forces someone like me to limit and constrain my potential through kind of like a negativistic logic, right? Anyway, so that's kind of, for people who might be listening who are like not on board with just like, burning every fucking thing to the ground and starting like a libertarian socialist arrangement in society as fast as fucking possible, and getting everybody on board with it. Like that's my fucking argument, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like, I'm not like, anti-Marxist, but I do have a lot of problems with Marxism, and I think one of them is that the narrative is centered on production and ownership of production, and not just the bare fact that the upper class like controls what you do. They control what you do with your time. They control what you do with your body.
Yep.
They control what you wear.
Mm-hmm.
They often control what you think through education and mass media and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the control that is the problem. It's not.
Yeah. Yep.
I mean, ownership is sort of a form of control, but like ownership really only allows you to exclude people from doing something with an object, or a person, I guess. And control is like being able to decide what is actually done with that object, versus like being able to decide who gets to do something with that object.
Exactly.
Or a person again.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I think that leftist narratives should focus more on control, because I think people have more of a problem with not being able to decide what they do for themselves than they do with who owns things and who gets to decide like what is like who else gets to do things with what. I don't know. I've lost the plot there, but I think you get what I'm saying.
No, I know what you mean. Like people talk about like, I won't stand up for tyranny until like fucking corporations, like your entire life is just dependent upon these markets, which you have to participate in or die. So then you have to go get a fucking job, and of course you have to follow the rules of the job, or else like you have to buy shit. So if you're not getting the money and the wages to buy shit, you have to do it. I mean, frankly, I feel like you could sell Marxism to people pretty easily if you started to rebrand surplus value as taxes, and your boss as the tax man, and you just start co-opting all these conservative talking points back into Marxist talking points. I don't know. I don't have enough time to start that grift, but if anyone wants to get started on it and kick me 5% back, no, I'll be here.
Wait a minute.
Well, that's actually surplus value, so...
Yeah, right. So that's... Yeah, I think you were talking to the right people then, if you want to do something like that.
Yeah,
we would love to be part of your small business.
All right, so John, do you want to plug anything?
I don't particularly have anything. I'm just a small guy at xjohnvaldez on Twitter. But I would say there are a lot of great organizations out there doing things. Black Socialists of America. They have a website, so you can Google them. They have a great Twitter following. Also, like Symbiosis Rev, which they're working with, and was it the Jackson Cooperation in Jackson, Mississippi, is also another great organization to check out.
Jackson.
Yeah, Cooperation Jackson. The actual correct way to say that. One of the greatest things I've ever seen from them is the Jackson Kush Plan, which you can Google. and find the actual their strategy for everything they're doing. And I think that regardless of where you start, that's a document that should be distributed and plagiarized by every socialist organization in this country.
I agree.
So that's all the things I'm going to plug for today.
Are you also on Pastrami Hour? Is that
Yes.
out yet?
Oh yeah,
Okay.
That's right. I do a podcast. I forget sometimes. Yeah, check out Pastrami Hour with me and Cheech Guevara.
Nice.
Oh yeah.
All right. Chris, you don't have anything you want to plug, do you?
Well, I'll just say this thing, which is kind of my analysis or my attempt at praxis. Really is something that I've been thinking about for a while, and actually has exactly to do with Operation Jackson and the Jackson Kush plan and district. Which is that I looked at I overlaid some maps on each other and kind of eyeballed it, and it looks like, besides a lot of like the embedded history and stuff in the Jackson Kush region and kind of what they've had to deal with and who they are and all this stuff. I will say that I think that a lot of our future organizing in a more in terms of more specific kinds of places is going to be in the small to medium urban zones where there's like a medium amount of population density. So, you can still reach people, you can still build mass and build, these cooperations and stuff and network them. But it's not too far out, so it's not too rural and kind of remote, but it's also not too urban where there's just like huge, like cop shit and huge billionaire shit. Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think it's going to be honestly in a lot of these like mezzanine regions, and where there's like not quite as much coordination, that you can seize that and you can build better relationships with those locals. So folks who are trying to leave the city or folks who are trying to leave the country, think about those middle areas. There's a lot of potential there, and also look at maps of future climate change. Find those middle areas in places that are not necessarily going to be hit quite as bad, or if you're more emergency prone, go to the places that are going to get flooded and burned in those kinds of areas, and get ahead of the fucking disasters with people, because that will also help us to pull in the people who are most ready to get together and form coalitions.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. So check out our other episodes if you enjoyed this. I thought it was great. Thanks a lot, John, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we would love to have you back again. Very, very good discussions. I think I'm going to split this into 2 parts because we went on.
It's a nice hefty one. Yeah.
So if you enjoyed this, check out our other episodes, neighborsciencepodcast.com.
Mm-hmm.
Our Twitter is at neighborscipod. Everything else is at neighborscience. We have a Patreon. I put out 1 bonus episode, and I was planning to try and do more. And then Chris had to move, and then I went on this 2-week trip to
Speaking of pressure by the market.
And then just a bunch of other shit happened. And so I haven't obviously kept up with that. But I really want to do it, and I think Chris is interested too, especially if we can get a little extra income from it. That would be great. So, check that out. I think the first bonus episode was okay. We'll try and do more. I think that's it.
Yeah. Awesome.
All right. We love you. Bye.
Love you. Bye.